Hi, everyone. Welcome to this monthly webinar with CHASNZ, where we're going to talk about energy-based safety. I'm just waiting another couple of minutes just because our participant numbers are still going up as people are dialing in. So I'll just hang on for a sec and then we'll get cracking. All right, I think that's slowing down a bit now, so we'll get going. So yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome along to this webinar on what is energy-based safety. Just by way of intro, just in case any of you don't know who I am, my name's Jon Harper-Slade. I'm the General Manager for Health and Safety Innovation at Construction Health and Safety New Zealand. I've been here since the start of things, and my job is to do exactly this. Really, it's about translational research and communication. So I spend a lot of my time talking to people who are a lot smarter than me, which isn't hard because nearly everybody is, to really find out what's going on in the world of safety research and try and bring that to everybody, really, just to share that information and give you the opportunity to try some of these concepts and see if they work for you. So before I properly get going, just really wanted to provide some credit and some kudos to Dr. Matt Halliwell and his team at the Construction Research Alliance. This presentation wouldn't be possible without them. This presentation is based entirely on their work and the work that they've been doing for the last few years. These types of research alliances, in fact, the one that Matt started at, based at the University of Colorado, is the first of its type in the world, as far as I'm aware, of bringing industry and science together to solve the problems that industry are facing and develop good, actionable research, which has got a solid evidence base that sits behind it. All the research is done in the field, and they have access to just thousands and thousands of hours of work to find these things out for us. So big plug to them. Here are some links. So this presentation will be available to you all after. And this is just where you can get more information, more resources. So if you go to the CSRA website and go to their knowledge library, all of the resources about everything that I'm going to talk about today are there. They're freely available. The research papers, the guidance, the tools, they're all there. There's further information and research at safetyfunction.com, which is a website that Dr. Halliwell's put together. And there's even some training that you can pay a small amount of money for and get access to. I've got those resources and they're really good. And also as well, the Edison Electrical Institute have done a load of work in collaboration with the Construction Safety Research Alliance, and they've got a ton of resources if you follow that link as well. Okay, and before we get really going, I just wanted to plug this. So as I mentioned, we wouldn't be here standing about talking about energy-based safety if it wasn't for the Construction Safety Research Alliance in Colorado. Now, great that all of that research is happening in North America, but it'd be really good for our construction industries if that sort of activity was happening closer to home. Well, it is. So SHINE is about to launch and have its inaugural meeting next month in Melbourne. SHINE is an initiative that is being hosted and run by RMIT, which is a university you'll all know in Melbourne, under the leadership of distinguished Professor Helen Lingard. This has been created in collaboration with the CSRA in Colorado, and it's a research alliance that CHASNZ are happy to be affiliated with and a part of. And the idea really is to just copy the good work that's happened in North America, and again, just bring industry together to solve some of the problems they're actually having and produce in a quick way some evidence. So this is the idea really, is that, to shape and engage with the industry to make sure that the research program addresses the real world problems that people are having. And then to make sure that that research is done really well and to provide industry with opportunities to get involved. And this is kind of how it works. Fundamentally, if you want to be a partner with SHINE, you can. So if you're a larger organization and listening and you're interested, you can actually contact them directly. Again, I've got some contact details for you, or we can put you in touch. Fundamentally, you put a donation into the SHINE Research Fund, and that has some tax benefits because it's a donation. Then you get to come together and select the projects with everyone. They're allocated to the most important projects. Those projects start. Industry have an opportunity to get involved. And that's a really good way for people to pick up on some of these tools and techniques and have access to some are the best researchers in the world to help us solve some of these problems. And then those research results get communicated, and we end up doing things like this to help people understand what that research is telling you. And it speeds it all up. You know, the current way of doing research can be quite slow because of funding and getting things published and whatnot. This is just a fast track method to get that research done quick in a time where it's useful for us all. So fundamentally, that's how Shine works. I've probably covered most of that. And that's Helen Lingard's contact details if anyone wants to get directly involved. If the $35,000 a year donation is a bit rich for your blood, if you're a sort of smaller organization, we will provide in other opportunities for businesses to get involved in Shine. If you can't do it directly, we'll be able to do it through us. So just get in touch if that's something that you're interested in. Right, back on track. Let's talk, that's why we're here, right? To talk about what is energy-based safety. So this presentation really is in three parts. So the bits of energy-based safety that I'm going to focus on are, number one, the energy wheel, which is around our people's ability on the front line to recognize hazards. The second part we'll talk about is how we differentiate between low and high energy hazards. And there are some real benefits for doing this, including allowing safety teams to focus on what's important. And then we'll talk about high energy control assessments, or HECA, which is really exciting, actually, that uses these energy-based concepts to come up with a better metric, a monitoring metric for our control environments and where our exposures are. And I would say that's probably our first real opportunity to actually measure safety, if you believe safety is the presence of controls. All right, so let's get into the first thing, which is energy wheel. Hazard identification is a vital skill, and I use the word vital deliberately. You know, vital means that we can't do without it. You know, drinking water is vital, so is eating. Hazard identification is vital if we're going to be able to do any type of risk management. Now, the issue that we've seen really, or learned through the CSR's research, is that if you take the concept of situational awareness from applied psychology, what we see is that there's kind of three components, right? There's the kind of the hazard recognition, which is perceiving a stimulus, recognizing danger. And then there's the risk perception piece, which is getting some meaning from that and understanding the level of danger. And then there's the risk tolerance side, which is anticipating an outcome and deciding how to behave. Now, I know that most of you on this call, in fact, all of you on this call, will be pretty well read around this, and you'll know that there's lots of research evidence and work that's being done in risk perception and risk tolerance, you know, how we decide what the level of danger is and how do we react to it. But actually very little up until quite recently about how good we are at doing this hazard recognition, even though it underpins all of our risk management processes. You know, in fact, our practices are built on that implicit assumption that we're getting hazard recognition right. What I'm going to show you is the research has shown us that that's not true. In fact, before I move on, what I'll say is that, and I think I've omitted the important slide here, which is that fundamentally what the research has shown us is that people are only able, through using their own instincts, to find around 45% of the hazards that are actually out there. And there are kind of two reasons for it. So fundamentally, reason number one is about 35% of the hazards are missed because we're all human and we have a cognitive blind spot in our brain to see in certain types of hazards, and I'm going to talk about that. And then the other 25% are missed because the work that people do isn't reasonably predictable. And the sad thing about that is that what I've seen personally when I've read in incident investigation reports are that in hindsight, after an event, you know, those hazards appear really obvious to us. And so therefore we kind of make comments that people weren't paying attention, they didn't have appropriate situational awareness, whatever that means. Or we just say they're just complacent or reckless in some way. So our people are actually getting treated pretty badly on the back of the fact that before the event, some of those hazards that look obvious afterwards aren't reasonably predictable. So let me kind of talk through first then this cognitive blind spot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a slide just for about 20, 30 seconds. And all I want you to do, just use your instincts, don't go mad, and just have a look at the slides and just maybe note the first 2 or 3 hazards that you see. Just do that. It's not a test, by the way, and obviously being on a webinar, you won't get into trouble if you didn't get it right. It's probably a very safe place to do this. Okay, so you've had a little look. As I say, I'm not going to really test you, but this is just the data that came out of the research that CSRA did around this. And broadly, what it tells us is there are certain types of hazard, like gravity and motion, that we will all see, or pretty much most of us will see straight away. So, if you look at like number one, you all probably saw, your eyes were drawn almost directly probably to those large suspended loads. And, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that if that load was dropped, that we'd probably die. Your probably eye was, drawn to those pipe supports and maybe even the uneven surfaces. And the uneven surfaces piece we'll come back to when we start to talk about low and high energy hazards. But you'll see at the bottom end of the scale that hazards like radiation and temperature and to a point electrical hazards tend to go immediately unnoticed if we're just using our instincts. And there have been thousands of hours of field research here, and that broadly, in fact, it has been seen across the board that this is true. So moving to a different context for this. So, looking at, if you read these two scenarios and then looking at the pictures, what I want you to think about is, would a person see the danger by their instinct, either the one on the left, one on the right? Would you see it by your instincts? The other question is that, what sort of training might help people recognize these types of hazards? And what sort of thought processes are going on while you're in that scenario? And third of all, like, is there an emotional or physiological response to being placed in this situation? Now, I think you'll all probably agree really quickly that scenario A, standing somewhere high at the edge and looking down, I think you'll see that, instincts would kick in. I think you'll feel that. And I think the reason why the instincts would kick in is that we're probably going to have an emotional or physiological response to that height. It's common for most people to maybe feel a bit dizzy, maybe, that vertigo feeling, just that kind of sense of fear when we stand at height. I know that it affects more of us than others, and there are complicated reasons for that are way beyond my skill set for explaining. However, what we'll accept is that, what I hope you'll all accept is that in scenario A, that we'd all feel something and intuitively know that that's dangerous. Whereas if we go to scenario B, what we'll see is that, and what I'm talking about, I don't know whether you can see my arrow, but excuse me, but just the area in front of this roller here, you see we've got a vertical face. It's sandy clay soil, which, if anyone knows anything about sandy clay soil, doesn't stick together very well, can collapse at a moment's notice. But actually, if we were there on the site, it feels fairly airy. It doesn't feel very confined. And if somebody said, can you just go over and just put your hand on that wall? I think most of us would probably either do that, or if we were forced to do that, probably wouldn't feel the same way as which we would feel in scenario A. So interesting that there's two hazards here, both with the same potential for death. But actually what we're saying is that we have sort of different responses to those hazards depending on what they are. So there's something going on there. Okay, the second set of scenarios here, very similar. And the questions here are, as you read these scenarios, by the way, it's difficult to do. What I quite like to do is get some video here, because what's going on the left-hand side is that fundamentally the auger is rotating. So you've turned up, you've walked onto the site, and that auger is rotating. Okay, whereas in scenario D, you've walked onto the site and that auger is not rotating, right? It's not spinning. It's sitting there. Now, again, the question here is that, would a person see the hazards by instinct? Would they do that? What sort of thought process is going on? And is there an emotional or a physiological response? And so what that's kind of showing us is that in scenario C, where that auger is moving, the risk is quite obvious to us because, again, it's motion, and we seem through our instincts to pick that motion up. And so instinctively, even without very little training or experience, your instincts would tell you to stay away from that thing that's moving. It's obviously quite dangerous. Whereas in scenario D, what we've got is that the auger, the bit is stuck. So you may have some audio clues. There'll be the engine will be laboring because it's stuck. There may be some vibration. That sandy, silty stuff will be coming off the top. But actually, because the thing's not moving, it may be that the individual doesn't see the hazard, and that could be quite common. So what we're saying is that, also what I'm saying is that it's actually the same hazard, right? Which is that, if that auger kind of rotates, or in the case of it stuck, releases its energy, there's a risk that we could get drawn in, trapped, or wrapped around that thing. Okay. So subtle changes in that scenario actually make quite a big difference to the way that we're able to perceive and recognize that hazard, that source of danger. Also quite interesting. So what's going on? Well, there was a little bit of science, some experimental research done 2018. There is a paper, Hu et al. 2018, and some experimental research where they used this technique called functional near infrared spectroscopy. Full disclosure here, this is way outside of my expertise. So I'm just telling you what I've been told and what I've learned. So there'll be neuroscientists everywhere having fits about what I'm saying, probably. But broadly speaking, what we're looking at here is kind of two parts of the brain. And so what they're doing is they're monitoring the brain, and they're looking, this spectroscopy is looking for blood flow. Because what we know is that if a part of the brain's working, it's demanding blood supply because it needs oxygen to work. And when we're looking at certain types of hazards, different parts of our brains seem to light up through this research. And also as well, the response time's different. So broadly, what this research has shown is that things like motion and gravity hazards initiate a response in a little part of our brain, which is called the amygdala. And the amygdala sends signals to things like the hypothalamus. So it lights up our sympathetic nervous systems and our adrenal glands, which is our fight or flight response, right? So, which is why that if we're standing on the top of a high-rise building and look down, it's why we feel that fear, okay? And it's instantaneous, right? It's very quick because the part of the brain's very small. It doesn't require a lot of oxygen. So it's almost like shortcut brain processing to give us these almost instinctive responses to sources of danger that we've evolved a response to. And if you think about it, those types of hazards have existed on the planet as long as humans have. So it's likely that evolution, our evolution and our development of our brain has developed these types of responses to these sorts of hazards over a very long period of time. And the graphs on the screen kind of show that very fast response to the stimulus, which means that we're able to take action quite quick as well, right? Whereas over on the other side is that when people are looking at things like, I don't know, chemical hazards or pressure, these things that are hidden away, these stored energy type hazards, a different part of the brain seems to light up. And these are the sort of more advanced sort of brain processing locations. So the one lit up in the picture is a sketch of the temporal lobe of the cerebrum. And the thing that you can see there is that it's massive, which means needs a lot more blood, a lot more oxygen to work. And from the response graph, you can see it takes longer for it to work too. So when we're doing hazard ID, we're kind of seeing some hazards which are making that amygdala light up, gives us an emotional response. And then on the other side, we may even see or notice a hazard, but there's no emotional response, and it can take us longer for our brains to process that that might be a hazard. So that's what's going on inside the brain. So instincts alone are only giving us 45% of the hazards because of this, mainly because of this. And as I mentioned, because the work's not predictable. So what do? Well, the research did some evaluation of this. And so the thing that I'm going to talk about energy wheel in a minute, this is the data from the evaluation of this energy wheel. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because this excited me in a way, because I've never really seen, it's really, really difficult to prove any kind of intervention for safety really works. We kind of have to go through an act of faith. Our ways of measuring can be a little bit arbitrary sometimes. And so it's really difficult to know whether somebody else's words, not mine, whether the safety juice is worth the squeeze. Somebody from the Research Alliance said that, and I really like that term. And so they've been using this methodology, which is called time-interrupted regression analysis. So what they do broadly is, in this case specifically, I think they took 9 crews, and these work crews are in different organizations, and all they do is they come up with a methodology for observing and measuring people's ability to do a thing. So in this case, hazard ID. So, where they go do that, and they measure their ability to do it. And what you can see on the graph is that people learn. because everybody's smart. And so over time, you'll see an increase in people's ability to do that as they do more of it. Okay, so as we've seen is a natural learning curve or learning improvement. And then at different times in those different groups, the training intervention about how to use the energy wheel, and the energy wheel is introduced to the team. And then using that new knowledge and skill, they're then using their instincts to find hazards, and then using the energy wheel, which is what I'm going to explain to you in a moment, helps them kind of fill in the gaps and find some of those hazards they're missing. And so the researchers continue to measure their ability to do that with the energy wheel, and you'll see that they get better and better. And when the data is overlaid, what you can do is overlay the point in time where the intervention is being delivered to the people, even though in reality it was delivered at different times. And what that does is it isolates all those other effects that might impact people's ability to do hazard ID. And it isolates the effect of that one intervention. And fundamentally in the data, if you see a gap like that, like in beta 2 there, all right, that tells you that there's been a positive difference in the performance. If it followed through in a direct line where that dotted line is, that would say that what you're getting is normal learning curve. And by the way, when lots of training organizations tell you that their training is going to improve somebody's ability to do a thing by a certain amount of percent, you have to be really careful that they're not just selling you the natural learning curve, because obviously the difference between the delta at the beginning and the delta at the end could be just normal learning curve. And so this is really important, that there's actually some really good evidence to support that these mechanisms work through actual field observations and field studies using really good scientific methodologies. So I don't know why, but I seem to have cut out the energy wheel slide. So sorry about that. So look, the energy wheel is broadly a wheel that's got 10 main sources of energy on there, gravity, electrical, chemical, biological, etc. And it's not very complicated. It doesn't require any paperwork, any real spend. These things are designed to work with your existing processes. So it's fundamentally about putting this energy wheel in people's hands, and we've got helmet stickers and stickers for hazard boards to enable that to happen. We've seen people printing energy wheels onto the sleeves of PPE. You can really do what you want there. And all people really need to understand is, number one, instinct alone is not going to give them everything, but it gives them something. So we do that. And then it's really using the energy wheel to augment what you're already doing to fill in some of those gaps and get more of those hazards identified. And here are some of the tips around that. So that it helps us do what we already do, but just do it better. So that's important. It augments what we're doing. It's not a replacement, doesn't require changes in paperwork, etc. Okay, and it adds structure and strategy to briefings as well. So energy wheel doesn't need to be just using hazard hunts on the front line. Anywhere where we're trying to do risk management, energy wheels are really good prompt. It's actually what we call a cognitive mnemonic. It's a way of helping us draw attention to something that we might miss, right? So fundamentally, anywhere where we do that, particularly in those briefs, energy wheel is proven to do a good job. And that we can use it in all other ways. So I don't know if you're doing a safety by design type process. Again, energy wheels are a really good prompt to make sure that actually we're dealing with all the sources of harm. All right. I was saying about don't change paperwork right away. Your people will use this, and your people will tell you if your existing processes butt against it or not. And they're the ones that will probably give you the best indication of what would need to change in the future. This is really important because I've seen this with people using it at the moment, well-intended, but not quite the way to go. The energy categories are not important. It doesn't even matter if somebody thinks a hazard that they're seeing is a chemical source of energy rather than electrical. It makes no difference, because the energy categories are just prompts. What we're still interested in is the specific hazards themselves, not the energy categories. They're just there to help people. And this is really important, that what's been observed, and I've seen this myself, is that where energy wheel, is used for things like briefings or toolbox talks, our really experienced people on the front line, it draws out that tacit knowledge, that knowledge that they've just gained over the years about these different hazards. And so it draws out better quality conversations. So really good. So that's energy wheel. So look, that's the first part of our presentation, and we're running on time, which is unusual for me. So now I'm going to move into the second bit. And the second bit is really all about differentiation between low and high energy hazards. So the icons on this slide are broadly the Construction Safety Research Alliance's top, what are they, 10, 12, 1, 2, 3, yeah, 12, 13 of the major high energy hazards that feature in construction. You'll have to exclude some of the measurements because obviously it comes from America. So I am going to redo these with the metric version. Obviously, electricity greater than or equal to 50 volts, we use volts. So that's quite interesting. Falls from elevation. So 4 feet in new money is roughly about, I think it's like 1.2 meters. So what we're saying is if somebody can fall from a height of 1.2 meters or over, gravity, their acceleration due to gravity is sufficient enough that by the time they hit the ground, they have a potential to develop 1,500 joules of energy, which is enough to kill a person. And that's how this stuff's calculated. So the research for a lot of this was done way back in the 60s and 70s by the medical fraternity. So this information's been around for a long time. So we absolutely know the magnitude of energy that's required to cause death, serious injury, or chronic ill health. And what it probably does is it helps us in a couple of ways. So number one, differentiation between low and high energy does a couple of things. Number one, it may be an opportunity for us to hand some of the autonomy around managing certain types of hazards back to our operations, leaving room for the safety team to focus on high energy hazards, the things that kill, the things that give chronic ill health, the things that change people's lives forever through major injury, and kind of just letting go and letting the organization, if they're working with low energy hazards, to decide themselves how they might want to manage that hazard, or actually, if at all, they feel they need to. Which actually is really good for the reputation of safety for me, because, you know, you all know this, but, you know, we have got a bad reputation for getting involved in dumb safety a lot of the time. And I think a lot of professionals and practitioners get really frustrated when they're dragged into a job where they're dealing with something like, you know, bee stings or insect bites, when meanwhile there are things like crane operations going on and, you know, we're worried about people crashing their cars and dying. And it really overwhelms our safety team. So perhaps this differentiation between low and high energy is a better way of you know, talking about what safety teams are for and when they'll get involved. So that's one idea. The other idea as well is that, you know, our management systems themselves can cause us to do really dumb things. So if you think about gravity and suspended loads, not all suspended loads or not all dropped objects have the potential to provide high energy, which, as I say from the research, is this 1,500 joules number. So, you know, dropping a screw off a scaffold isn't really the same as dropping a hammer. And but what we can sort of find out, you know, what we can find ourselves doing is, and a good example is vehicles and driving, right? Is that we have all of these things marked as critical risks in our businesses, and our management systems say, you know, if you have an event associated with a critical risk, it requires, you know, some form of in-depth investigation or some form of response. Sometimes people like stop work, whatever it is. But, you know, we're talking about, you know, potentially then people moving around in car parks where, you know, their speed is less than 50 kilometers an hour, which is what roughly 30 miles an hour is, causing that same response when actually the energy doesn't have the potential to cause that kind of severity of event. So it causes a distraction. And again, it makes us, you know, look like we're overreacting to things that aren't dangerous. So, and, you know, there are some forms of energy out there where it might not be clear as to whether it's high or low energy, whether or not it's something that we should be responding to. And the link that I provided before at Safety Function, they've got a free energy calculator that you can use, and you can download it as an icon on your mobile phone. So you've got an energy calculator in your hand. And so where we're not sure, you can actually make a scientific calculation as to whether it meets the energy threshold and whether it's something that we would count as a high energy hazard. Now, if you look at the chemical and radiation section as well, there's this opportunity not only to pick those safety hazards up, those sources of energy that, you know, present risk of death that way, but also these things that can kill and also cause chronic ill health, you know, chemical, radioactive, or even biological sources of energy. And instead of obviously using energy type calculations, we have got you know, workplace exposure standards, which give us that line between whether it's a low energy type hazard or a high energy one. So, you know, it's not just about safety hazards. We can bring in health to this as well. All right, so that's the differentiation between low and high energy hazards. The third thing I'm going to talk about then is high energy control assessments. So high energy control assessments, I think really exciting. I'm not going to labour the point too much, but we all know that we've got a problem with measurement in safety. We've got way too much, gravitas being placed on things like injury frequency rates, which the science is really clear about, not really being very useful, not statistically significant in any way, and actually a random measure of noise. So the question always been is that how do we measure safety? And I suppose the question underneath that then is, what do we mean by safety? So if I propose a definition that safety is the presence of really effective controls for these high energy hazards, meaning we have an environment where people can't be killed or seriously injured, that for me is probably a really good definition for safety. And HECA then provides a measure of that safety in terms of a monitoring metric that can show the presence of those really good controls, but also show the exposures from less resilient controls. So I'm going to talk through fairly briefly on how HECA works. It's not all of it, and I can't fit all of the energy-based safety stuff in one webinar or presentation. Nor should I, because it just give you all overload. But we have lots of information on our website and lots of resources available through the links I've provided that can give you everything you need if you want to experiment that. You can also get in touch with us if you want more info, and we can help you out and link you in with what you need. So high energy control assessment is it's a metric, and it measures the proportion of life-threatening or high energy hazards that are observed to have an adequate control. So for us to do that, we need to sort of define what's an adequate control. So again, here are all our high energy icons, right? So we've been through the process now, right? We've got people using the energy wheel to find sources of danger and recognizing some of those sources of danger that they were missing before from their instincts. We've then got a process to say, well, is that source of energy high or low? And if you remember back to that first slide, and I said, the rough ground that we spotted around the gravity hazard, the slips and trips. Well, the most common outcome for a slip or trip in that context is not death or serious injury. And so that's how we would separate that out to say that, hey, look, the suspended load, that's a major gravity hazard. And so that's a high energy hazard, and that's something we're going to focus on. But maybe the slips, trips, and falls is something that awareness is raised with operations, and operations can decide whether it's a hazard that they need to manage, what controls they need, and whether they need any processes or procedures, which stops the safety team from getting branded as the sources of DOM safety. If operations want to produce a process which people think is dumb, then that's kind of up to them, but at least they're not dealing with the high energy, it's the low energy hazards, right? So we've got these high energy hazards now selected. We know where they are in the field, in our operation, in our particular task with our crews. We know what they are. So now what we want to know is whether the control we have in place is what we call a direct control, which means it's an adequate control. And for it to be regarded as a direct control, it needs to meet these three criteria. And I'm going to come to that now. So fundamentally, direct controls will save your life all by themselves, even if somebody F's up. And that's really important. So for it to work, it needs to be targeted at that source, directly at that source of high energy. So if you control for a suspended load, it needs to prevent that load from falling. That's what it needs to do. It needs to be strong, which means that it needs to mitigate that amount of energy present. And that control needs to be installed, maintained, implemented properly. And so it effectively provides a barrier between the energy and the people. So that's the second criteria. And I think that when you do your critical control evaluations currently, you're probably meeting those two requirements reasonably, right? You're saying, hey, look, it targets that source of danger. We've got effective barrier. That's probably as far as we're going. But this is where we bring in the principles of human performance and say that actually, for a control to be direct, deemed adequate and effective, it needs to remain effective even if we mess up. We know that people make mistakes. I do, and I talk about my mistakes a lot because I think that's useful. Error is a gift, as somebody once said to me. So fundamentally, these controls need to work regardless of what we're doing around them. And I think you'll find that some of the critical control evaluation processes you've got, where you're looking at some controls, and a good example would be tag out lockout for electrical hazards. Okay, tag out lockout doesn't meet that criteria in most cases because it's not forgiving. If I forget to put the padlock on, tag out lockout doesn't work. I get fried. If I operate a tag out lockout process in a bit of kit that looks similar to the bit of kit that I work on, but it's different in some way, then that tag out lockout fails. So it's not error resistant. Now, we're not saying you don't use tag out lockout. What we're saying is it doesn't meet the criteria for direct control. So it'd be shown up as an exposure, and that's quite important. Okay, so this is what energy-based observations look like. So fundamentally, we identify our high energy hazards, we assess the control using those three criteria, and then we kind of fundamentally mark it down. So is it a high energy hazard? Yes. Does it have a direct control? No. Versus high energy hazard, yes. Direct control, yes. And that gives you a metric. It actually gives you a number, right? So it gives you a percentage number, the percentage of your high energy hazards that are sufficiently controlled versus the others that present some form of exposure. Now, important things to know about HECA is, number one, you can't call it HECA unless you follow the rule book. The rule book's fully available. It's in the links. This is page 1 of it. It's not a very long rule book, but actually what CSRA have done, and I really applaud this, if they have, now I can't remember whether it's trademark or copyrighted, it's one of those. But the reason why they've done it is anybody can use HECA, but to call it HECA, you have to do it in a consistent way. And the reason why that's been done is because if we're going to use it as a metric, and if we're going to do comparisons across organizations or even outside of organizations at industry level, we need to make sure that people are going about this in the same way. Otherwise, it's not a comparable metric. So that's why they've done that. So if you take some of this stuff and decide to tweak it, and call it your own, that's fine, but just don't call it HECA. And it's not, it's not data that we'd accept to compare with others. So this is just some examples of some data and how it can be presented when you do HECA. So you can see that you can do these evaluations, and these evaluations are occurring all the time. These observations are being done by operational people on the front line. So, frontline workers, frontline supervisors, etc. It's not a complicated process, and people get better at this stuff over time. And that's okay. We don't expect people to be perfect. And then what you start to see is as that data is coming in and being collected, your data is starting to change. And over time, you can see your trends about, how much exposure have we got versus how much success have we got in control. So that's useful information. You can actually put it by source of high energy and talk about, a proportion of those that are coming up as controlled and those that are coming up as an exposure. And that's a really good way to draw attention to the things that we need to deal with. So you can see here, like the gravity hazards on this slide, falls from elevation over 4 feet or 1.2 meters, that broadly they're seeing that there's actually quite a small portion of them are directly controlled, and much of that is controlled in some other way. And so what that says is, number one, we probably need to focus in that area to see if we can improve our gravity controls from working from height. And then over time, if that work is effective, we should see that graph change. So that's just a way of we can't look at everything at once, but it gives us a really good metric to focus on where our exposures are. And that's good information, and the sort of information that leadership teams and boards would appreciate to know how effective these controls are and where the exposures are. And also as well, it's about effective monitoring and supervision. So there will be many activities within your organizations right now where the boys and girls working on the front line and working with a high energy hazard, where a direct control isn't available. It might not be locally available. It might not be available within the organization. There are many high energy hazards in construction where a direct control isn't currently in existence anywhere, that the science and invention hasn't caught on. So this data is really important for showing us those things where there isn't direct control available and where we're relying on a suite of alternate controls that don't meet that criteria, which means then we need more monitoring and more supervision, because we know that we've got our people working exposure and they need to know that too. I think that's really important. We can't give people false levels of comfort that they're being looked after and they're safe if they're not. And it also allows us to know that where these direct controls are in place, that we know that our people are safe regardless of what they do. That's important too. And then we can even sort of look at the data as to why our exposures are exposures. And look, there's my example of lockout tagout, right? Is that they've been and looked at lockout tagout controls and the operations in different areas. The data's come in and we can see that at some point they haven't got controls present. So that would be an exposure. The control hasn't targeted the source properly. That it's not implemented or operating properly. So the control's good, but it's not put in properly. Or like I mentioned about lockout tagout, it's very rarely immune to human error. So therefore we can't call it a direct control, which means we need some extra stuff in place. CSRA come up with this really great way in their work looking at metrics and measurement to compare different metrics together. And there are 6 kind of component parts that metrics, need to be valid, objective, important, functional, clear, and predictive. And currently, as HECA is assessed, bearing in mind it's a new metric, finding that it's extremely valid, very objective, obviously important, reasonably functional and clear. And why that comes down a bit is that it does require some explanation, but hasn't been proven to be predictive yet, but it's likely to be in the future, which makes it a very, very good all-round metric when you compare it with others that definitely don't look the same. So why am I talking about HECA and why do I think it's really special? Well, because it brings in that energy-based safety, which is good, defendable scientific evidence, with those principles of human and organizational performance. So it's a really good mesh of, traditional safety research with more emergent safety research and brings the human into play because, we're as much part of the system as the other bits are, right? So that's really important. It focuses on serious injury and fatality. And like I say, we'd love to be, focused on everything, but we can't. Ethically, we don't want people to get hurt. But frankly, with our capacity and the complexity of the work that we're doing, focusing on serious injury, fatality, and chronic ill health is where our resources really need to be pitched. And I think we should be very unapologetic for that. And so this helps us do that and maybe stops us getting directed by some of the trivia. And empowers our operations to deal with some of that sort of lower risk safety because they're more than capable of doing it and more than capable of making those decisions without us. The fact that this is ongoing and regular monitoring and sampling is really important. That, like you can see from the graphs, we can actually get insights that actually provoke action. And as someone once said, there's no action without learning and no learning without action. So actually having insights that provoke some form of action to improve the safety of the work people are doing, for me is laudable. It is easy to communicate. And what I find, certainly talking to people who are using this stuff already, is that it's really intuitive to frontline. Risk is just confusing for people. I mean, it's confusing for me and I do it for a living. So actually changing that conversation to energy, talking about hazards, because that's what our people at the front line are exposed to this danger. That's what they're doing. They're in the business of trying to recognize these hazards, these sources of danger, and try and understand whether the controls that they've got available for them, number one, are in there, and number two, they're going to work and keep them safe. And they want to know if there is exposure. They want to know the level of danger they're working in. That's what our frontline people need to know. And using energy is a really good way of having a common language that gets away from some of this gnarly, confusing safety terminology. And we know that risk's subjective. We're all frightened of different things. So our perception of danger is different depending on our experience and our knowledge and whether we're afraid of stuff. And that really doesn't help when you're fitting the same risk into any box of a 5x5 matrix. That's not really helping anyone. And again, we can align what we say with what we do and what we measure. And that's really leading us towards this balanced approach for our measuring and monitoring. And what you'll see is if you go to the knowledge library at CSRA and those other sources of knowledge, you'll see that there's other work around metrics. And we're going to be doing some more work on this year. And we're already working with industry participants around this. But actually to get this, if you like, the full suite, like I think if we're going to measure safety in any way, I think I agree with the position of CSRA here that we need 3 types of metrics. And this is really about saying that we need some input measurement. All right. So that's the stuff that we're doing to make the job safe, right? Now, at the moment, lead indicators seem to be just us counting the number of times we do a thing. We don't know whether the thing's effective anyway or not in all cases. And number B, counting the quantity of it doesn't tell us whether it's effective or whether it's going to have an impact. And so there's a whole bunch of resources there about measuring the quality of the work that we're doing that we expect to enhance safety. So measure the quality of pre-work briefings, measure the quality of leadership observations, measure the quality of the safety observations your people doing, collect that data, because that'll tell you how safe you expect the job to be. Then HECA fills the gap in the middle, which tells you how safe is the job at the moment, because that's monitoring data. It's coming through from across your operations. and it's live. So you're constantly getting an updated data on where are exposures, where are our controls. And then what we can do is the output measurement, which is how safe were we? Rather than using things like injury frequency rates, which don't tell us anything, we can use that same data and make it severity based, so much more responsive to the environment. And also look at the numbers of serious injury events and also your potential serious injury fatality events as well. Okay, so all of those metrics then give you a bit of an idea about how safe the job was, and they should match up. So we should be seeing high quality safety work going in. And if we've got high quality safety work going in, our control environment should be really good and effective, which means our people are working in as safe environments as we can give them. And then the output metrics are telling us that we're not having severe harm. So therefore that stuff's working. That's the idea. So, hey, broadly 3 minutes over. We've got sort of 10 minutes left. I'm going to stop the share and bring myself back on the screen. And let's see if we've got any questions that people want to ask. Susan, are you there?
Yes, I am. There's a few questions.
Yeah, okay.
Can you elaborate some more on the value of not changing the procedures early on? This person has some pushback from stakeholders around it, so just wanting a workable process. Would the first step to implementation be a training piece?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, look, whether you like it or not, people are doing hazard ID right now, and they're probably just not doing it that well. And it's not their fault. That's broadly the message there, right? Is that, we're doing our best. It's always best, particularly with these new concepts, is just to give it a go. You don't need a lot of structure and a lot of planning for this. And yes, a little bit of training or information or instruction is definitely recommended, and it doesn't need to be complex. I mean, I sat down with our finance manager, Kiwi, and explained it to him in 5 minutes in the office by asking him to use his instincts to look around our office and find some hazards and write them down. And then we pulled the wheel out and we worked around the wheel and just said, right, are there any hazards that meet gravity, electrical, etc., etc.? And lo and behold, we got about another third out of that, which is just from sitting in our office doing it. So yeah, I think some information instruction training, it might be a video. For passing on information like this, you don't need to do fancy interactive training. You might make a video, you might do it in a toolbox talk. And I think it's about being iterative over time, is let people use it and get their feedback, find out what they like, what they don't like, what works for them. But it's always a dangerous game to be starting to change your processes early. There may be unintended consequences for doing that, and you might end up finding that you've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. Anything else there, Susan?
Yeah, definitely. So you might have gone into a little bit more detail around this later on in the presentation, but is a direct control a little bit like an above the line control or critical control? Can you talk to this?
Yeah, no, it's really, I mean, it's different. It's different language, right? So when we say above the line control, we're referring to the hierarchy of controls, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, which, is a kind of upside down triangle that tells us that certain types of controls seem to be more effective than others. There are limitations to that model. I mean, the hierarchy of control is really useful, but what above the line means is that fundamentally we're using a control which tend to be more effective, which would be those isolation, engineering, elimination type controls. And knowing that if we're just relying on administration or just relying on people wearing PPE, that's probably not going to be so effective. What I would say is that model can be is useful, but it's not totally comprehensive in terms of, in reality, what we know is that we would implement a control that says above the line, but that control needs to be augmented with a bunch of administrative controls to make it work. Whether that's training, whether that's information, instruction, whether that's rules, whether that is some sort of protective equipment for parts of the equipment that can't have above the line control. So it's about suites of control. So whereas high energy control assessment is number one, looking at those high energy sources, whereas when we talk about hierarchy of controls, we're talking about any hazard that needs controlling broadly. It focuses on that really important stuff. The second thing it does is it's very strict criteria, which means that it changes the data that we've got. And I think that takes away some of the biases. You mentioned critical control verification. The challenge with that is it can be quite subjective. And the problem with it is that some people's perception of what a good control is may be different. And particularly what we know from the research is that often the human factors associated with these controls are missed. And that example with the tag out lockout is a common one, because certainly in the past, when I've done critical control evaluations, I've regarded those tag out lockout processes to be sufficient. And now it's caused me to question whether they were. And so it's a different criteria and a different way of looking at this stuff. And you don't have to, again, replace what you're doing. That's really important here, right? We're not asking you to stop doing your critical risk evaluation processes. We're not asking you to change any of that. What we're saying is that maybe HECA can be something that augments the sort of information you have and gives you better assurance in your business around those controls which are working, which means that probably need less monitoring. We just need to monitor the control to make sure it remains direct, but we know the environment's safe. And then draw our resources to those areas where we know that our exposure, regardless of the amount of exposure to those high energy hazards that are going to cause death, and keep people as safe as possible. And it allows us to divert our resources. Susan, was that?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Got a couple more minutes and some more questions are firing through. So just on HECA, so you just mentioned HECA before. Is HECA in use at construction sites anywhere in New Zealand yet?
Yeah, people are playing with it. It is early days. I know that there are a couple of organisations that are starting to play with it. What we're doing is, or what I am doing specifically, is I've already spoken to a number of stakeholders across industry from the different parts of our industry to put together a community of practice. And then what we will do is we will sense make HECA and do some experimentation with it within those organizations, and we'll learn together, and we'll put some resources out for you all that are have kind of been made a bit more New Zealand construction specific. It is new. It isn't well tested in New Zealand, and so it's something that we absolutely should embrace and adopt, but perhaps maybe to start off small with some micro experimentation, maybe work on 1 or 2 crews first and let it grow naturally rather than pulling levers and just moving straight to something that's relatively unknown. As I said, the science is defendable, the evidence base behind it's strong. There's lots of use of this in North America and the results are looking great. So this is really our opportunity to start this conversation in New Zealand and start to partner up and start to use this thing and play with it.
Excellent. So another question, because I'm just firing through now, which is great.
Nice.
We're getting some commentary around our CHASNZ resources as well, that we should be plugging them more. So thank you very much for making that comment. We do need to promote our energy resources more, because there are some really excellent, collateral that we've developed with the team over in Canada and things as well. So should stick include life-altering injuries, like you say, health?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, energy-based safety is unapologetically focused at the things that kill, seriously injure. And there is opportunity in there, like I mentioned, particularly under those energy categories of biological, chemical, radioactive. We can pick up quite a lot of those health and even some of the well-being type hazards that exist. Like under biological, we might pick up that risk of humans to people, violence and aggression. We could pick that up in there. As I say, that noise, dust, fume, smoke, vapor, fits well into that chemical area. So it helps us identify those. And like I said, that we've already got really good taxonomies for and processes for working out whether those sources of energy or those hazards represent a high energy or low energy hazard. And that's really where the safety team can come in with that technical expertise to make that decision for the organization, or help with those calculations, so that broadly with the high energy hazards or generally the hazards that exist in your operations, you can come up with something similar to that icon page for what are your high energy hazards and what are your main controls. Now, it was a good point, Susan, around our resources. So we've got quite a comprehensive set of resources on the CHASNZ website for Energy Wheel. And you'll see in there that actually broaches into the control conversation as well. So we've got quite a comprehensive guide for high energy hazards and some of the common controls that exist in industry. So you can download those resources for free and use them away. So loads and loads of resources on our website, and there's more coming. So as we start to do more work with HECA, we'll certainly develop more resources and have them on the web page as well to make it easy for you to try and perhaps adopt these types of mechanisms.
Excellent. One more question, and what we'll do as well, everyone, is we will collate all the questions and respond to them and things as well, and put them onto our website along with this webinar recording and presentation over the next couple of days. But one more question is, I'm struggling to think of many controls that are not reliant on some human involvement. For example, harnesses require people to connect properly. A drop net, if used to protect against people not harnessing correctly, may be subject to being installed incorrectly. Really good question there.
Yeah. And actually, I agree. And I think that that's what using HECA will show you, is that many of the controls that you're relying on for high energy hazards are not direct. And it will ask you to question as to, are your people working effectively, and do they have the effective monitoring for that danger, knowing that they're working in exposure? And how many of your people who are currently working under a control like that isn't direct and actually feel that those risks are controlled properly? And how much monitoring is being done in that area because the organization thinks that's sorted. So I totally agree. Direct controls are difficult for a reason, because when they're implemented, they work. And there is another part to this story, and I'm back in Colorado in November, and hopefully I'll be coming back with some more information about the work that they've done on alternate controls. Now, alternate controls are about this conversation where people on the site have recognized the danger, they've used Energy Wheel, found these hazards, they've had this conversation about what are the high energy hazards, and done some form of assessment around whether those controls are direct or not. Now, maybe at that stage that the workers are saying, we don't have a direct control. And the answer from the boss should be something like, well, what do you have? And what's being developed is really a rule book around what a sufficient layer of alternate controls would look like that would allow a crew or an individual to work in the presence of that high energy hazard, which is an environment where there isn't direct control, so there is exposure. So what would the layering of alternate controls look like? And that's really the nature of that conversation, which is you've probably got people that are working in environments where a direct control doesn't exist. And so therefore, what you're saying is there's uncertainty now about how much alternate control needs to be in place and what sort of alternate control needs to be in place to satisfy us that work can continue with some advanced monitoring. And so that information is coming in a couple of months.
Excellent. That's the end of the questions. Thank you, Jon.
You're welcome. And so that's probably us wrapping up for the day. So I think we're about 30 seconds to finishing. So, hey, look, thanks for everybody coming in. As I say, just that quick plug for SHINE, Safety Health Innovation Network. If you're part of a larger organization, please get in touch with either us or Professor Helen Lingard at RMIT and get involved, because this is then our part of the world doing this stuff ourselves and generating this type of high quality evidence and tool sets to allow us to improve the safety for our people. So please do that. And yeah, thanks for your time. And I will get in, and any questions that haven't been answered here, I'll put some answers in and we'll post them on the page with the webinar recording. Okay, on that note, have a nice lunchtime and I'll see you soon. Take care.